So I don't, how many of you have been to St. Gregory Nyssa in San Francisco? Has anybody been there?
No.
I want to go, but I haven't.
It's this amazing church. A couple of clergy that were associated with one of the other big churches in San Francisco sort of decided that they were going to really work with kind of much more orthodox imagery. And so they built the two of them, raised money and built this church. It's right across the street from Anchor Steam Brewery, directly across the street from Anchor Steam Brewery. So if you go to San Francisco, you've got two reasons to go to Potrero Hill. But anyway, and there's a lot that I could say about this church. It's very, very interesting. But they've divided the building into two spaces. One space is where the liturgy of the word happens. So you gather in one space to hear the lessons and the sermon and to do the prayers. And then at the offertory, everybody gets up and dances, literally dances into and encircles the altar. And the rest of the service is done standing around the altar. Above the altar, around the sort of cupola, whatever you want to call it, is this whole series of dancing saints. And so when you dance into the altar space, you join the dancing saints. And I don't know who all of these folks are, but you can guess,
Francis Bacon is one of them.
Yeah. You got
Elizabeth the First is one of them.
You got Shakespeare and Elizabeth, and I don't know who the horse is. Or the donkey, is it Balaam's ass? I don't know. So you got a lot of folks, and this is just a piece of them because they go all the way around the altar.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I just thought that I would show that because clearly, as the folks at St. Gregory's have done, they have added some folks to their circle of saints that probably some others, more traditional Episcopalians or let alone Catholics, might not have added. And so if you ever get a chance to go in and take a look. It's an amazing space. The other thing I'll say is the liturgy is kind of Episcopalian and kind of not. And when I was the Episcopal campus minister at UC Berkeley, I used to take students on field trips to various churches. And we went to St. Gregory's a couple of times, and we went to the cathedral, St. Grace Cathedral, a couple of times. And always, hands down, the students said, let's go back to the cathedral.
Really?
They weren't so interested in going back to St. Gregory's. They said, yeah, that's kind of interesting, but that's not who we are. So, a lot of fun.
I heard about this and wondered, just throw this out there, wondered who we would add to our cupola of saints at Good Shepherd.
Oh, hold that thought. We'll get there. Maybe not today. Probably not today. Maybe in a few weeks.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do, I'm going to move my camera because I'm looking down now rather than looking up. There we go. What I'd like to do is tell you where this idea came from and how I envision working with it for the next several weeks. I've been playing with this for quite a while. This whole idea of who are the saints that we honor. How do we choose who they are? This debate, in some respects, has been going on in the Episcopal Church for a while. We have 3 different books that sort of talk about the people who aren't already listed in the prayer book. And why are there 3 different books? And how have they grown like topsy over the last 30 or 40 years? So that's one of the things that sort of spurred me on in this, especially as I send out every morning on the Facebook. I send out whoever the Episcopal Church is honoring that day. So and there's a kind of a debate in the calendars. So that's one reason. Another thing is that in the last 4 or 5 months, especially as all of the drama has encircled us nationally and all of that. And there have been some folks who have said, not so much about Good Shepherd, but have talked about the Episcopal Church in general, saying that this isn't the church we remember. One person specifically said, this isn't my grandparents' church anymore. And so I began to wonder, what did their grandparents' church look like 40 or 50 years ago? Who were the saints? What did the church say about who it was by who it chose to put in the calendar? And so that was the other piece that's sort of rolling around in the back of my mind. And so I thought that given the season of Epiphany, when we celebrate and pay attention to how Christ's light is manifest to the world, that's what this whole season is about, that why not talk about how the church has decided who it is that manifests that light on Christ's behalf to the world. So that's kind of where this all came from. You know, those of you who have taken, who've participated in classes know that I never start at the beginning. I always start way before the beginning. As I hinted at in the sermon, that we all want our context. But so some of the underlying questions that I really want us to keep in mind as we go through things over the next several weeks is what, why, and how do we remember? How do we remember things, and why do we remember things, and what things do we choose to remember? We'll talk about that more specifically as we go on this morning. But just think about your own family structure and what you grew up with. Is how did you remember, you know, people before you in your family? You know, your aunts and uncles and grandparents and great-grandparents. Did you sit down and go through the family tree? Was it in the big family Bible and you could go through it and point out all of these things? How do we remember? How do we remember certain family things? Because we eat the same food all the time. We all had probably similar Christmas menus or Thanksgiving menus that were a little different than, you know, so how do we remember? And then what do our symbols, including people, because people are symbols, what do they say about us? Specifically, in our case, the Episcopal Church. The people that we honor say something about us. And you can like that or not, but that is who the Episcopal Church is. The fact that Michael Curry is our presiding bishop says something about the Episcopal Church. That's very different than what the church may have said 40 years ago. The fact that Kim Lucas is our bishop says something very different about the Episcopal Church in Colorado than 40 years ago. So the symbols, including human symbols, say something about us, specifically the Episcopal Church. So those are some underlying questions that I'd like us just to keep in mind. As I say, the schedule for what we'll be doing will happen kind of at its own pace. We've got about 5 Sundays between now and the beginning of Lent, if we take out the Sunday when the annual meeting happens. Whether we spend all 5 Sundays on this, I don't know. It depends on what kinds of questions y'all raise and how caught up I get in and other things and drag you along with me, like what happened a little bit this morning. So it'll be at its own pace. But what I want to do really today, and then going forward, is talk a little bit about holiness, and you'll see why in just a minute. And then what is the background for how the Episcopal Church, in our prayer book and in these subsequent books that we have, how we pay attention to how we remember. That's the calendar, that's our rituals, that's our the people we choose to add in as saints. That's how we do that. And so a little bit of background in terms of what our Jewish forebears did and do, and then how did we develop our calendar, And then we'll start, as I put it here, moseying through our Anglican heritage. And again, I don't have a precise day-to-day schedule. We'll see how far we get today, and we'll just keep going forward. So any questions about any of that before I move on?
Okay. I like it.
Sounds good.
Okay. So we're talking about saints. And saints, this is my definition, is a holy being. The word saint comes from the Latin sanctus, which is also just the word for holy, which is the Latin translation of the Greek hagios, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew kadosh. All three of those words mean roughly the same thing. Of course, the big building in Istanbul was Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom. So, you know, the holy thing is not always just applied to people. It can be applied to places. It can be applied to God. The picture that I've got over on the left is of the cherubim in the vision of Isaiah before the throne. Holy, holy, holy Lord God Almighty. Sort of attributing holiness to God in this particular manuscript. But basically what it means is hallowed, which is kind of, well, holy, hallowed, yeah, but consecrated or set apart. And we've, over the course of time, added to that this idea that it also has to do with moral superiority. You know, if you're holy, that must mean that you're really righteous. You know, you don't dance, you don't gamble, you don't drink, you don't do all those things. In fact, there are, you know, that group of churches that grew out of the Methodists that were known as the holiness churches, because they talked about personal holiness in terms of all of these moral qualities that I just outlined. But that's not where holiness is with relation to sanctus or hagios or kadosh. It's sacredness, a state of dedication to God's service. Indeed, the word kadosh often just means heaviness, that it's weighty. You know, I think most of the folks who, even if they were able to address, well, did you know you were declared a saint? They would all say, well, I didn't deserve that. You know, I was a sinful human being, or all of those kinds of things. So holiness and sanctity and morality are not necessarily linked together. So as we start talking about the saints, as we go forward, just kind of separate morality and uprightness and, you know, all of that. If you think about good old Peter, you know, here was somebody who was probably not the pinnacle of moral ethical standards there. In the New Testament, in Paul's letters, but not confined to Paul, believers, just simple believers, are referred to as saints. So we are saints, according to the New Testament. Why? Because through our baptism, to use that language that I used earlier, but in other ways, we have dedicated ourselves to God's service, and so therefore we are saints. But of course, that word grew, and the idea of holy people or holy things is not confined to Christianity at all. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but in Shia Islam than Sunni Islam, there is a pretty large pantheon of Muslim saints. There are holy individuals in Buddhism. You know, so this is something that pretty much every religion does. And to go back to one of my opening questions is, there's a reason for that. We remember these people for a reason. So saint became the title of honor and respect used individually of persons distinguished among their fellow Christians by the degree of their devotedness to Christ, and then commanding the public veneration of the faithful. So these people, we look at them and say, boy, are they devoted. And so we should hold them up. It's one of the ways that we remember. Okay? Thoughts, questions?
Father Gary, as a cradle Presbyterian, the saints were those who believed. And that was kind of a standard belief. So I was probably more in high school when I started to learn about Thomas of Aquinas and other saints who were very important to the development of Christianity. And it was a real aha moment for me. I know I said to Father Craig when I was going through confirmation class to reaffirm my faith was I thought that we had John, the author of Revelation, and then John Calvin. I mean, there wasn't anybody in between. So I think this is important for those of us who didn't have a sense of the lineage, the line, and the history of Christians who, because they were from Rome, were seen as not that important to saints. I think this is important.
And so this goes back to these questions: what, why, and how do we remember? And I thank you for bringing that up, Irma, because we'll get to that. Probably not today, but we'll get to some of those issues as we move along. So I wanted to start with sort of our Jewish antecedents, and that question of what, why, and how do we remember relates again to individuals, but to also other to practices and to things. And of course, Christianity grew out of Judaism in reaction or in relationship with sort of the wider Greco-Roman world, and we're heirs of that, as you know, we sort of all recognize. So let's start with sort of Jewish antecedents. And you know, saints' days, as we start thinking about them, are holy days. Some of them more so, or given more importance by the church than others. So I thought, okay, well, let's start with Jewish holy days. And for Jews, every day in some respects was a holy day. There were daily prayers. In the temple, there were morning and evening sacrifices. You hear these referred to throughout the Bible, as well as various services of psalms and prayers at 9 and 3. So you've got this sort of daily rhythm of sanctifying time throughout the day. And then that marker for Jews of the Shema, that statement of faith that every Jew would say at least once a day: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Right? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. This is that creed of Judaism. It was bound up and put into the phylacteries, into that thing that they would tie to their forehead. It's in that little thing that's put on the doorposts of Jewish houses, the mezuzah, is this prayer or this statement of faith. So every day is made holy by, or was made holy by these recitations of the Shema and by the prayers. And further on in this passage in Deuteronomy, I'm not going to remember the whole thing, and I didn't print it all out, but it says, "And you shall teach this to your children and your children's children." So there's a point at how we teach, and what it is that we teach, and what it is that we use as we teach. And this phrase over in the on the right-hand side, the graphic, My father was a wandering Aramaean. We'll come back to that again in a minute. But that's, there's that wandering Aramaean. Not so sure who exactly that was. Was it Abram? Was it Abram's father? There's some discussion about that. But here's an individual that's important to remember. And it becomes very important for the Jews as they go forward. So not only is every day a holy day, but every week had pieces to it that were holy or sacred. There were regular fasting days. Monday and Thursdays were sort of set aside for private fasting in Jewish tradition. But then, of course, Shabbat, the Sabbath, every week, the Sabbath. And that day, that 25-hour period, 25-hour period, is as important for Jews as any other holiday. Whether it's Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or anything else, Shabbat every week is a holy day. And what are we remembering? If you think about that, what is remembered through that is that God set this time apart. God was an act, as we sort of intimated in the first reading this morning with creation, at the end of that story, and on the seventh day, God rested and hallowed this day. It's a commandment, right? Exodus 20, verse 8, it's in the 10 Commandments to pay attention to this day. There's no similar command about the others that has sort of the same weight. And so you're remembering that you are imitating God by observing the Shabbat. Very, very critical for Jews. Then you have this annual cycle, right? The every year festivals, beginning with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's Day, begins while there's a certain celebratory because of all of the various foods that get eaten during Rosh Hashanah. It is also 10 days of penitence and preparation for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is marked by fasting, complete fasting, prayer, and repentance for, again, 25 hours. So there's this sense that God hallows time, and we remember that through what we do. We remember all of the things that God has done in the new year, the beginning of the harvest, all of those kinds of things, but also to set ourselves right in God's eyes through prayer and penitence and fasting. Then there are these pilgrim festivals. And we may not think of them in this regard, but these are festivals when it was expected that Jewish men would go to Jerusalem every year. The first one being Passover, is that you would go to Jerusalem. The Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Perhaps, since so many of these have sort of agricultural connections, perhaps this is when the new flock had been born. The new sheep are out, the little lammies are running around, right? And so what do you do then? You slay the Passover lamb. Now that we have the new lamb, you offer that. So you've got this connection to the regular cycle of life, but also certainly with the Passover, the commemoration of the Exodus. And so how many of you have been or ever been to a Passover Seder with Jewish neighbors?
Been to Seder.
Yeah, most of you. You know that there are a series of questions. Why is this night different than every other night? And the answer is not, well, way back when this happened. The answer is on this night, where the people around that table begin to participate in this great experience of liberation and renewal. So we remember so that we can participate in it, or we remember, we become members again through that liturgy. Similarly with the festival of Shavuot, which we would normally call Pentecost. The reaping is 50 days after Passover. It's the reaping festival. You're starting to take in grain. So it's the wheat harvest. But 50 days after the Exodus, about the time the Jews arrived at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah and the establishment of the covenant. So every year, there's the remembrance of that significant piece of their history. And then the next pilgrim festival, Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, a harvest festival. It happens following Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's the festival of the new wine. This is when the grape harvest is done, right? and so we've got the new flock, the new grain, and now the new grapes, this sort of agricultural thing. But the Sukkot also commemorates the dwelling of Israelites in their booths, or their temporary dwellings as they're wandering before the entrance into the Promised Land. And it's also been overlaid by a couple of other things, the choice of the house of David, as well as the choice of Jerusalem and the dedication of the temple. So these days, these holy days, become points of remembrance. And we have them too. Certainly we have them in our calendar. Two other festivals, and then I'll stop for some questions. Purim. How many of you have heard of Purim? Yeah, Purim is the defeat of a plot to destroy the Jews of Persia. So this is the book of Esther, that intriguing book in which God is never mentioned, not once. But Purim is this great celebratory festival, and it almost encourages everybody to get drunk. To the point where your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing. You dress up in costumes. It's just this crazy festival, but it celebrates this this victory in some respect of the Jews over this an evil guy in Persia. And then the one that we just finished, Hanukkah, which of course is well, I won't say of course, it's not a biblical festival. Doesn't show up in the Hebrew Bible. It appears in what we call the Apocrypha, but it's the miraculous victory of the Maccabees and the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem over the Greeks. It's a minor holiday. It's not the same as Christmas. It's a minor holiday. Doesn't have sort of the weight of all of the rest of them. But again, it's a way of remembering. It's a way of remembering who we are, what God has done for us, and how we move forward in our relationship, our daily relationship with God as faithful people. Questions at this point?
Well, yeah, just a question about holiness.
Yeah.
In terms of saints, would it be stretching it to say that it's applied from above, so to speak, that God, as he is understood by Muslims or by Christians or other gods, if you are Buddhist, say, are involved in the application, or is it something that's earned by earthly people apart from application from above, so to speak?
Okay.
Or is it just a definition of how people live in relationship to their God or gods?
That's a great question, and we'll get to it.
Okay.
I hope we'll get to it today. We'll see, but we'll certainly get to it next week. But that's sort of at the root of a lot of this is a question of how do we remember? What are the significant things that we remember, and what do we use to remember? And so, what do we choose how do we recognize those important things? Certainly, given many of these festivals and practices that we see in Judaism, those got put into the sacred text, right? They're either in the Torah or in the case of Purim in the book of Esther or some of these other things. These were put into the texts that Jews felt had been given to them by God. So was it, on the other hand, Hanukkah, I think they said, oh, this looks like a good thing to celebrate. It says a lot about us. There's an old saw that I've heard from many Jewish folks that said you can describe all Jewish festivals in 6 words or 8 words. They came, we fought, we won, let's eat. So, but moving to people.
Good. That's good.
Go ahead. Okay, moving to people, certainly there were Jewish holy people. And we find them throughout, Hebrew scriptures. The first one being this, my father was a wandering Aramean, which is a very clear statement that we started out as wandering people. This is who we are. We have a wandering background. And certainly for Jews to end up in a place where we were no longer wandering is also something significant about the Jews' relationship with God. But if you think about all of the other holy people that Jews remember, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how often do you hear that? If not all 3 of them together, or at least 2 or 1 of the 3 of them, often throughout Scripture. Moses, all right? Elijah, David. David was certainly no moral exemplar, right? yet, if there was a saint, David would be one. Moses failed God, but yet, important. Some others that you might not think about is Jeremiah, the prophet. Isaiah gets quoted all the time, but in one of the book of the Maccabees, which is, where we get the celebration for Hanukkah, Judas Maccabeus is in there. He has a vision where he sees Jeremiah in heaven invoking God's blessing upon the Jews. So we have this suggestion that dead people, not to put too fine a point on it, dead people are in the presence of God praying on behalf of live people. And this shows up before Christians, before Christianity developed. So here's another one. You also see references, and we see them in the Gospels, to the tombs of the martyrs and the patriarchs. You read about those in the Gospels. So even at Jesus's time, there was for Jews not only a series of days and practices that helped each individual Jew remember who, what, and why they were related to God. But then there were also some special people that epitomized what that relationship might look like, regardless of any other kind of moral failings, that God was able to use them in achieving God's purpose. So does all that make sense? And so the question is, what, and you can ask this of yourself, but we don't need to do this right now, but what were Jews remembering in all of these festivals and with these people? And not to put too fine a point on it or sort of take, they're remembering that they are related to God and what God has done for his people. And so it had to do with sort of defining and redefining and explicating that relationship for the Jews. Questions, thoughts before I move on? Nope. Okie dokie. So we've already kind of answered this last question of what are holidays or holy days for anyway. And I would say that going back to this Deuteronomy 6 thing is you claim who you are in relationship to God, and you teach it to your children. That these holy days or holidays are there to remember and form. To remember and form is how we form ourselves as believers in whatever tradition, is by remembering how we got here. This is true for many, many historic religions, is that we've got this formation piece. Doesn't work for some others, not quite so important, for example, for Taoism, that doesn't have quite the same historical sense as Judaism or Christianity or even Islam. So early Christianity, we've got a few minutes, we'll just get started and then we'll get into more of this next week. So early Christianity, growing out of Judaism, had its own rhythm of daily prayer, because of course these early Christians were Jews. And so they were there in the temple for morning and evening sacrifices and the times of prayer. This is reflected in the Gospels and in the book of Acts pretty clearly. So that became part of our heritage, and it's reflected in our daily office in some respects. That develops in a little different ways, as we'll kind of touch on in a few minutes. So there was this daily prayer, but adopting from Jewish forebears there was this development of a weekly rhythm. It wasn't the same rhythm as the Jews had. Certainly many early Christians would have observed the Sabbath, maybe not in quite the same strict way, given what we've seen about Jesus, but they would have observed it, but they would have gathered again, and we have evidence of this in the New Testament, on Sunday, which they would call the Lord's Day, which is either the first day, the day of recreation, or the day of Pentecost, all of these things, or sometimes it's called the 8th day. Those of you who've done some Curcio kinds of things will recognize this 8th day, but it transcends the 7th. So this idea that Christianity goes sort of—
Jason, you're going to need to use a computer downstairs for communication. Mary's still struggling with her phone, but she's still struggling.
Yeah.
So we've got this rhythm of the days that have on top of it, of course, the Eucharist. So throughout the days of the week, you are engaged in what's known as chronological time, or chronos, which is sort of everyday time. And then on that 8th day, or on the Lord's Day, you step out of ordinary time, of chronos, and into kairos, God's time. And you eat God's meal in terms of kairos. You engage in something a little bit different. There was a weekly rhythm early on in Christianity for fasting as well, but it was different. It wasn't Mondays and Thursdays. It was Wednesdays and Fridays. We are different than our Jewish forebears. And so we're going to celebrate these things a little differently. We also have in the New Testament this indication that there were holy people already in the New Testament. Certainly the first one that we remember clearly is beyond Jesus, is the deacon Stephen. Got a whole chapter of Acts that's devoted to this guy. And what we learn from this chapter is that he was chosen by God as one of the early deacons, to help distribute the food to the widows. But he also bore witness. He preached the gospel. And for that, he was martyred. And so, he at the end of Acts 7, he was stoned to death. And you'll remember that at the feet of a young man named Paul, or Saul, Stephen's garments were placed. So here we've got this sort of first martyr that we remember. He's Stephen the martyr, Stephen the deacon. We also have in the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, a series of statements about what I would call saints. And so the idea is that most scholars would agree that Revelations was written around the end of the first century, maybe into the beginning of the second century. So only 60 or 70 years after Jesus' death. So, you know, it's a bizarre book. It's a lot of fun, but it's kind of bizarre. But you've probably heard language of the seven seals and the opening of the seven seals in the book of Revelation. So here in Revelation 6, John writes, "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar those who had been slaughtered on account of the word of God and the witness they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, 'Holy and true Master, how long will you wait before you pass judgment? How long before you require justice for our blood, which was shed by those who live on earth?' Each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to rest a little longer until their fellow servants and brothers and sisters who were about to be killed as they were finished." So you've got the holy dead surrounding the throne, praying to God, asking, and they're remembered as the holy dead for giving witness. And then at the end of Revelation chapter 20, you know, then I saw thrones, and people took their seats on them, and judgment was given in their favor. They were the ones who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and God's word, and those who hadn't worshiped the beast or its image, who hadn't received the mark on their forehead or hand. They came to life and ruled with Christ for 1,000 years. So again, the idea that martyrdom brought you into a special relationship with God became a point to which the church aimed folks. This is really valuable stuff, y'all, because these people who died, they are right there at the throne, and they are going to sit in judgment. So we remember, we teach each other through what we remember about what's gone on. What's gone on was these folks had died for the word, and they were being honored in heaven. Wouldn't that be a great thing for us? And I aim to be one too, if we think about that wonderful song. So it's 11 o'clock, so I'm going to stop here. We'll pick up with sort of post-New Testament stuff next week. But what I would like, please, if you've got any questions about particular saints, you know, I'm really curious about so-and-so, or I heard that so-and-so was demoted, or any of those kinds of things, you know, send those to me. If you can think about them really quickly, put them in the chat feature right now, because I don't want this to just be what's coming out of me, but I want it to reflect where your interests are, your curiosities, all of those kinds of things. If you think of something through the week, let me know. But what we'll do next time, moving into the next week, I'm just going to really preview. We're going to talk more about early Christianity going into annual rhythm, and then the age of persecution, good old St. Polycarp, and what happened with Constantine, because boy, did he have a whole lot to do with stuff, and more Constantine, and then into the Middle Ages, where it becomes really, really fascinating. And so we'll get into that, and maybe we'll talk, we will at some point, maybe next week, because this becomes important forward, Eleanor, is how did you become a saint? What was that process that you became a saint? So I did say we would get there. See, I even have a slide for it already. So we will get there at least next week. Yeah, and so that bottom line on that slide, one is canonized because, so there's the teaser. If you have any questions about saints, individuals, or any of that, please let me know, and I'll work it in. Okay? All right, folks. Good to see you all. Have a good week. Go out and pray for each other and our country and stay safe. And if you can get vaccinated, do it. and all that good stuff.
We do.
And we'll see you soon.